All right, so this week we're doing testing. I'm going to be honest with you. I've recorded this about 10 times now, and in every one, something has gone horribly wrong. So, if you hear this, um, hopefully it's because I finally submitted the recording. Okay, let's get started. So this week, we're talking about testing, and one thing that's you probably noticed when you did the reading was that Brown references talking about testing after you have created the goals. And we're doing it a little earlier. And the reason is that I think that testing can be useful for identifying student lacks. Okay, so LACKS, lacks. And we talked about how students have needs and wants, but they also have lacks. And I think testing can be useful for identifying those. Okay, so that's why we're looking at it a little early. Brown breaks testing down to 4 major types. One is proficiency. The next is placement. Next is diagnostic testing. And finally is achievement. So we're going to go through each one of those. For proficiency, you're looking for overall language ability. An important thing to note here is you're not looking at particular program goals. So it might be something as simple as labeling a student as beginner, intermediate, and advanced. Okay, now placement tests look a lot like proficiency tests. Often they're general language ability, so you're using a wide range of questions, a lot of chances for students to display their general skills. However, it can be slightly more narrow because it can help you start to hone in on what you want your program to accomplish. And you often want to try to identify where students are along in this path towards the ultimate goal. And so if each class is working on a different segment of steps to help a student move closer to the goal, you want to be able to place them into the appropriate course. It's also important to note that you want to have enough, the placement test score should create enough differentiation that you are able to clump students of similar levels into classes. So imagine that you get 500 students admitted to your program that are all in the intermediate level. Well, I mean, you could just throw them into, however many different intermediate level classes. But if you did some follow-up testing, you could probably figure out that some people needed a grammar class versus a writing class or a higher level of the different things. You might also be able to break the categories down a little bit more. So instead of intermediate, maybe you can group them into high intermediate versus low intermediate. So students of like levels get to be together, which can help in organizing the class and meeting needs and goals. But as I mentioned, on the face of it, they look quite a bit like a proficiency test. We can also do diagnostic tests. Now, diagnostic tests are always in relationship to some kind of goal. So what are students supposed to learn by the end of this course or the end of this program? And then where are they already strong and where are they weak? So imagine that you're teaching a course in speaking, maybe academic presentation skills are one of the goals. And maybe you have students give a presentation and you identify a student has high levels of control with vocabulary, high vocabulary use, but their pronunciation of the academic terminology is faulty, problematic, hard to understand. Okay, so strength, vocabulary, weakness, pronunciation of academic terms. That's the type of information that diagnostic tests can provide to teachers so that they can better modify their teaching. All right, the final one is achievement tests. Achievement tests are what we see predominantly through classroom education. So the teacher teaches something and then they do a test. So for example, grammar is an easy one. Let's maybe say that you did a lesson on tense, and maybe you've been practicing this lesson on tense, having students change the tense over and over again. What other activity you might want to do with tense? And then at the end of it, you test them on their ability to handle tense. That would be an achievement test. Why is it predominant in education? I mean, anytime you have a midterm where it's about like what you've learned in the semester, a final about what you've learned in the semester, little tests happening intermittently, any of those, if it has to do with what you've learned in the classroom, and a teacher gets to expect you to know it because they covered it in the classroom, it would be an achievement test. So the question I'd like you to think about now is which test types are useful at the needs analysis stage? And if you'd like to pause it, that would probably be good because there are answers on the next slide. Hopefully, you primarily thought about diagnostic tests. Through identifying strengths and weaknesses of particular students, it can allow us to modify our training for students, modify our goals for students if needed. Another one that I think is somewhat useful and it's a way of thinking about it is trying to understand overall language ability in relationship to program goals. And obviously all of you are teaching or have access to students that have already been put into a class, but there may be useful information to be gained from understanding their general ability because it helps us understand something about their lacks. And it may not be that you're trying to place them into the class, but it can help you understand if the students that are being placed in your class are actually at the level that you're being told they are, especially if you're being provided test scores that have already been conducted with these students. So tests that they've already taken maybe at the end of the last year. Does that line up with the type of placement test that you would like to envision given your programmatic goals? Okay. Now, once you start to narrow in on at least a goal of your test, if not the specific nature of it, it's also useful to think about how you'll be using the scores. And this changes the way that you think about what you're creating. So it's important to consider this. The two primary distinctions are between norm-referenced or criterion-referenced tests. Criterion-referenced tests take a standard, so some type of criteria, and then it tries to identify whether or not the student has accomplished or met that criteria. So for a lot of criterion level tests or criterion reference tests, if you hit a certain level, that's considered passing. Okay, so that's all the information you get from a test is passing or what level they think the student is at. You're probably dealing with a criterion reference test. This is different from a norm reference test because a norm reference test is its primary goal is to allow for comparison across the student population. So if you want to identify the very best students or the very weakest students, that would be norm reference, right? Because weakest is only in relationship to other students. When you do norm reference tests, often you have a bit of a bell curve. So if you've done anything with testing before, we know that generally within the population, right, you're going to have kind of a middle ground where a lot of people are kind of clustered, a lot of people are average. And the people that are extremely talented or extremely behind or challenged are going to start to drift off at the bottom edges. But most people are going to be clumped within a couple standard deviations of the actual average. Okay. In a norm reference test, one thing to keep in mind is if you get a score, I think I mentioned a little bit of this, if you get a score that says, for example, you're at the 80th percentile, saying that you were above 20% above 80% of the student at the top 20%, then that you're probably dealing with a norm reference test. Okay. However, one of the things is sometimes you can actually get scores that indicate both of these types of tests. So it can be a little tricky to figure out what its primary purpose is. So again, let's take a moment. So I want you to think about 3 different types of tests: the NIQ test, the GRE, and the Texas State STAR exam. Now, if you're not familiar with these tests, feel free to Google. Please do not Google just like, is an IQ test criterion reference? Because obviously the answer will pop up. But if you need to figure out something about the test itself, how it's structured, how it works, what types of reports people get from it, then feel free to do that and take your time to think about what type of test these 3 examples are. All right, so go ahead and pause it now. Okay, so hopefully you recognize that the IQ test is norm referenced. Primarily the scores are shown in relationship to other people. The numbers are really arbitrary. It's just how many people get those scores basically to try to differentiate IQ. Obviously there are some designated ranges. Historically 70's been used, I believe, as the benchmarker for mentally challenged or handicapped in some way. And there are upper classifications as well for like genius level IQs. However, again, that's in comparison to other people primarily. Okay. For the GRE, it's also norm reference. Here you're taking all of these potential graduate students and comparing them to other potential graduate students. So the scores aren't particularly useful unless you understand their relationship to what other people were able to accomplish with the test. And then finally, we have the STAR. Now it's typically considered to be a criterion reference. Now, if you looked up the STAR, if you weren't familiar with it, one of the ways that the STAR is used is to determine passing from high school, so allowing graduation. And I did a little research, so I'm not originally from Texas, so keeping up with the Texas state test is something that I have to actually look into. But it looked like you have to be able to pass in 5 different modules or topics within the STAR test. The main idea here, though, is that if you have passing, right, a certain level to just pass, you are primarily criterion referenced. Okay, but as I mentioned, the scores could actually be mixed together a little bit. So for example, let's say that you were looking at the STAR and you have a certain score that's required to do passing. You could still also tell people how many people receive that score or higher. It's usually the purpose of the test that determines what you do with the number, right? So any test could produce a score. It's what you plan to do with the score that's important. Okay, keeping moving. So let's say that you're thinking of maybe designing a test. I think that that's a useful consideration. Remember, you've got to identify some way, in some way you have to identify what a student lacks. And you may have been given test scores from your administration or something like that, in which case you already have some information about their abilities. Depending on the nature of the test, it might be placement abilities, it may be achievement abilities. However, this week we want to think about testing, and I at least want you to think about other ways that you could identify students' lacks with regards to a needs analysis. Of course, when you're developing and adapting a test, the first type of question would be what type of test? What is your goal? But let's assume that it's something about identifying lacks. So you're probably going to be dealing with something along the lines of placement or diagnostic. For either placement, diagnostic, or achievement, you have a whole bunch of questions then that you've got to start answering. So first of all, what skills does the program cover? And then you have to start trying to create assessment tools in relationship to that program. Remember, placement, diagnostic, and achievement all relate to what the programmatic goals are. All right, and you already have probably some level of programmatic goals if you're teaching a class, or if you're in a class that someone else is teaching. All right, so you're already working with some kind of goals. When you start to create an assessment tool, the first major tip from Brown, if you have the ability to pilot a test, is to create a test that's much longer than you actually want to have as your final test. Because then you're going to try it and see how it works. You also need to think about what are the major skills that students need to accomplish. Now that could mean, okay, well, we're doing a 4 skills course, so they need to have speaking, listening, reading, writing, and I need to have a little bit of all of those. So then you have to think about, well, how am I going to test reading? How am I going to test writing? How am I going to test listening? How am I going to test speaking? Okay, so you have to work backwards through the skills to make sure that you're hitting all of them in the test. But also, maybe you're just teaching a course in reading. So what are the major skills that students are supposed to accomplish in reading? Is it, do you have aspects of note-taking? Do you have aspects of inferencing? What are the major things that you want students to accomplish? Okay. So create multiple different items on a test or multiple different ways of seeing it through activities. So for example, if you're doing speaking, maybe you don't even really need a test per se, a written test. Maybe you could design an activity where they have to talk and you can do observation of those. Okay, but imagine you've got some kind of test with multiple items. You're trying to make it fairly long, or even if you have activities, kind of more than you need. And then you try it out. Okay, so now we're at pilot the test. And note the measures that are successful at highlighting strong students or weak students. So for example, if you have items on your test that everyone does incredibly well, or if you have items on your test that everybody does incredibly poorly, those are not useful at differentiating students, right? So what you really want are items where the good students do very well and the poor students do rather bad, right? They miss a lot of them. One interesting note here is when you're dealing with reliability of testing, one thing that you have to do is an item analysis as well to make sure that you don't have problematic questions. So for example, imagine you have a student that's doing incredibly well on your test. You know, they're an A student, they're going to get an A on this test, and then they miss a question. Well, it might be useful to look at how all of those really good students did. Did they all miss that question? In which case, maybe you wrote the question a little weird. Maybe there's a problem in the question. Especially if, you know, the weak students would be getting it right while the really good students were getting it incorrect. That would pose a big problem. You need to remove that item or at least rephrase it, figure out a better way of presenting it. Okay. So let's say you found these items that are really good at highlighting strong students and identifying weak students. The idea here then is remove everything else. If everybody's doing well on a question, get rid of it. If everybody's doing poorly on a question, get rid of it. It's not helping differentiate them, so it's a waste of time. All right, and so then you could shorten the test, make it a little bit more user-friendly. And finally, a couple of notes about administering the test. So let's imagine you've kind of finalized what you want to try testing them with. A few things about running it. First of all, you need appropriate conditions. Some basics here are students need to feel like they can breathe, so it needs appropriate ventilation. And students need to be able to see, particularly if it's a written test. If it's a written test, there should be so much light, not to the point that it blinds them, of course, but you can't have a dim area where students are struggling to see the test that you've given them. Appropriate conditions might mean some other things too. It might mean keeping an eye out for additional noise. So if you have them in a noisy classroom where they can get distracted by others, it might mean don't put them in a teensy tiny room where they get claustrophobic. You really have to just think about the space and make sure that it's not going to cause physical problems, but also emotional problems as well. Or psychological problems would probably be a better term there. Students generally should be notified that you're going to test them. Now, obviously, for achievement tests, sometimes we do pop quiz type things. Usually the goal of a pop quiz is less about identifying what they're learning. I mean, it might be a little bit about what they're learning, but instead, often the idea of pop quizzes is much more about motivating the learning itself. So making sure that students went home and read, went home and studied, and things like that. So usually it's a little bit less about what they're actually achieving than the motivation side of it. But for most tests, students should be aware that they're about to be tested. For one thing, it allows students that have anxiety to try to calm down and prepare themselves. But also for even like a lot of achievement tests, it's helpful for them to have a chance to, if they're expected to learn something, to have a chance to go back and work on that skill. Okay. When you're testing, you also need to have adequate materials on hand. So if you're doing a test, have more copies than you need. If students need to write on it with paper or pencil, pens or pencils, make sure to have some of those on hand. If you're doing a listening test, make sure the audiovisual equipment is fully functioning. If you're doing a speaking test, make sure that you can record. So all of these things, just make sure that everything's going to go smoothly, because you don't want to be panicking. And the more disruptions that you have during the test, the more distracted students will be from the actual content of the test. You also need to have proctors, and actually I meant to put qualified on the next item. But you need to have someone who's keeping an eye on students, making sure that they're not cheating, that also know how to answer questions about the test without helping students with particular items. So we don't want any accidental swaying of answers. So proctors need to be familiar with how to handle this test. Okay, and then you need to have scoring happen. So specifically for the raters, you need qualified raters. Now, scoring is particularly important if you have open-ended responses. So if you have multiple choice, the answer is A, they put B wrong, right? But if you're testing something like speaking or writing, you might just have a written paragraph. You might have an audio clip of someone talking about something. Well, how do you turn that into a score? For one thing, you need to assemble qualified raters. What qualified means to you might be a little different, but I've seen it defined in terms of degree, so they have a BA or an MA. I've seen it defined in, they have, that raters have taken particular classes or trainings or certificates. I've also seen, sometimes you even have raters that are simply native speakers, but they're not rating anything complex, right? So keep that in mind. Like, you can't just assume that most native speakers are able to just rate like a writing sample. Okay. So once you've qualified raters, then they need some kind of training of what to do with the sample of language that they've acquired. So are they supposed to read just for grammar? Are they supposed to look at vocabulary? Are they supposed to look at organization? I'm assuming a writing sample, obviously. Are they supposed to look at transition use? At a clearly identifiable thesis statement? What is the rater looking for? What's important? Some of this might be related to the programmatic goals. So if you have a course in content development, organization, you're probably looking primarily at that stuff. If you have a course in grammar, maybe you want to identify grammar problems. But they need some guidance. And often, even providing just like a rubric of things that they're looking for is not sufficient. Often it takes time rating together and reviewing people's scores to reach some consensus and to understand how other people are approaching the task. So you can't just throw them into it. You've got to help them work towards a just shared understanding of what you're expecting. Okay. Another quick thing about scoring is that appropriate records should be kept of the different scores achieved, how scoring was handled, making sure that you don't lose track of a particular student's scores at any point. Okay, so these are the bare basics of testing. If you're developing a test, probably my biggest suggestion is just start designing items or activities and then carefully evaluate what it is that your questions are testing. So Feel free, go through a creative stage, kind of like in writing where, sometimes free writing is just really useful for getting you going. If you're not sure where to start, just start creating stuff. Then go back over it and start identifying the questions that are actually on the skills that you're looking for. Okay, so that's my biggest tip. I hope this helped you understand testing a little bit. It'll be interesting to kind of see what all you are working on this week.